Oystein Fluge from the University of Bergen in Norway.
Last year I tried to get Dr. Fluge here, but the timing wasn't right for him to be able to be here. So this year we organized a symposium around his schedule. So it's really a delight to have him here. And when I read his first paper, I was incredibly impressed because Dr. Fluge is an oncologist. What in the world is he doing with chronic fatigue syndrome patients? And it's just simply because I think he basically accidentally met one and realized it was a serious problem, and he had ideas about how he might help them. And so he took that on. And not only that, but trying to understand the disease meant he had to also do a lot of things that were very remotely connected to oncology. But he did that. And the last meeting in London, when I was there, I think the most impressive of all the talks came from Norway. And Norway doesn't account for more than 50% of the population of the world. So they've done a fantastic job, and I think it was all because of Dr. Fluge's initial that Norway has now been a leading country in their research in this field. So it's really a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Ron, for those very kind words, and thank you for inviting me, and from the OMF for inviting me. Truly, it has been 3 wonderful days to take part in this working group meeting. For me as a clinician, also trying to do some translational research, it's been so interesting to talk to some of the most excellent researchers in the field. So thank you all to the researchers who came to the meeting, also to telling me and learning me. I have a lot to think about when we go home on the airplane and when we meet our colleagues at home, trying to move the field forward. So what I will do in the next 25 minutes is to tell you a little bit about our clinical trials and a little bit about the laboratory work that we have done, some of the metabolic features of ME/CFS that we see. And I'll call it a struggle for energy, because that's something I think that the patients describe to me. It's like they struggle. So this is just a picture of some of our group in Bergen, and to the right you can see the list of the study center, trial centers that has been taking part in the clinical studies, and some of the groups that we have collaborated on so far. And I'm happy to say that I have made several connections these 3 days with other researchers that we will continue to work together with. So in Bergen, we try to combine work on clinical trials in ME/CFS and trying to combine that with transitional work using samples from patients, blood samples mainly, taken at baseline and taken at serial at intervals throughout the trials to build a biobank. And then we aim to increase the understanding of disease mechanisms and try to be part in the efforts to develop rational treatment. So it's a very tight cooperation between the clinic, the clinical trials, the biobank, and laboratory work, in which we have a growing group of scientists also in Bergen at the universities taking part in this. So the focus for this talk is to give a brief overview of some of the clinical trials and also a little bit on the translational work. And I must tell you that the rituximab trial and the cyclophosphamide trial, they have not been published yet, so I'm not able to give you details from these studies. I apologize for that, but it's not been out in published yet. So why did I get interested in ME/CFS? And that was back in 2004, and the next few years, we had observation of patients with long-standing ME/CFS who got cancer or lymphoma, and who independently came to us and told us that this is doing something to my ME/CFS disease. And the first time maybe I just registered, then okay, but then it happened again, and really got interested to see if this was this was an observation that could tell us something important about the disease. So in the first years we had only 2 such observations. One was a patient in 2004 with Hodgkin lymphoma who received chemotherapy, including the drugs ifosfamide, which is very similar to cyclophosphamide. In 2004, we also saw a patient with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. In 2007, a patient with non-Hodgkin lymphoma who received chemotherapy with cyclophosphamide together with a monoclonal antibody rituximab for lymphoma. And both of these patients reported that there was a major change in their ME/CFS symptoms. Then we decided to track both of these leads. Could it be the chemotherapy? Could it be the B-cell depletion therapy with rituximab that made this difference to the patients? So we decided to investigate those in separate clinical trials, small trials initially, just to get some thoughts about this could be something worthwhile pursuing. I can tell you that if you look back now, 2004 to 2018, we have seen a total of 8 patients who have independently reported benefit from cancer treatment on their ME/CFS patients with long-standing ME/CFS. And most of these have actually received chemotherapy with cyclophosphamide or ifosfamide. So, to give you a brief overview of the previous rituximab studies, we first did a small pilot case series in 2008 and 2009. We just gave 3 patients a single infusion with rituximab and followed their clinical course, trying to register what happened to them. These had a transient symptom improvement. Then we did a small randomized phase 2 study which was published in 2011. There were 30 patients. We followed them for 12 months, and they had 2 infusions of rituximab for the 2 first weeks, and then just followed. And in this study, the primary endpoint, which was at 4 months, it was negative. There was no difference between the placebo and the rituximab group at 4 months, so the study was negative. But there were separation of the curves later in the study between 6 and 12 months at the secondary endpoints. So we were unsure if this was a sign of clinical activity that we should, but we decided to do an open-label phase 2 study with rituximab maintenance therapy. That was an exploratory study trying to get more knowledge about the mechanisms and to prepare for a later randomized study. It's a big limitation when you do an open-label study in this disease, because you cannot have any proof for a clinical effect, but you can have ideas about the tolerability and the feasibility, look at the response rate and possible toxicity, but it's no proof of effect. So we did this study with 29 patients, and we gave them 6 infusions during the first 15 months and followed them for 3 years. I'll show you in the next slide a little bit just to sum up this. But to give you the history of what we have done so far, we have also studied cyclophosphamide, because in fact that was what most of the patients had got who had independently reported benefit to us in our cancer clinic. So in cyclophosphamide, we first did a case series of 3 patients. It's unpublished. I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then an open-label phase 2 study, also without the placebo group, which is a limitation, and followed them for 18 months, now up to 30 months, with 40 patients. So this is what I will tell you a little bit about. Just to show you some of the data from the open-label phase 2 study, what is called the KTS2 trial, in which patients had the rituximab maintenance therapy. And you can see these are the SF-36, which is a questionnaire can give you information about physical function. You can see in the upper panel, vitality, bodily pain, social function, and mental health. And the red ones are the patients that really seem to respond clearly. The green ones are the moderate responders, and the blue ones are 10 patients with no response at all. And you can see from the curves, I don't know which side to point on, but if you look at the curves, the time axis is on the x-axis. And you can see that for the first 3 months, there's absolutely no change in these health-related quality of life parameters. But then you have increases, especially in the group that seem to respond. And in the time window, 15 to 30 months, they reach high values for these SF-36 scores. The group, which was half of those included, both for physical function, vitality, social function, and bodily pain. So was this a true effect of the drug, of rituximab? We can't say because it's an open label study, or there are major limitations such as the outcome measures, which was mainly self-reported in this study. Could it be natural variation of symptoms over time, placebo mechanisms, or a selection bias that we hadn't had included patients that, although fulfilling the Canadian criteria, by chance shouldn't be representative for a larger group? We don't know for sure. So we were discussing, is there a subgroup of ME patients that benefit from B-cell depletion therapy? And we interpreted the observed responses or improvements are probably related to the intervention. We had no responses before 4 months, which is not typical for a major placebo effect. But as we know from oncology and also from other clinical trials in autoimmune diseases, such studies have shown that it's very important to do a larger randomized and placebo-controlled trial before you can make conclusions. Especially maybe in diseases such as ME/CFS with subjective and self-reported outcome measures. But there's no doubt that the patients improved in these studies because these questionnaires, the SF-36 forms, and measurements of physical activity level, for instance by armbands measuring steps per 24 hours, all showed the same. Patients improved. But what was the cause of the observed improvement? That's why we have performed Rituximab, which is a multicenter, national, randomized, double-blind, and placebo-controlled phase 3 trial with either rituximab or placebo, 6 infusions in total during the first 12 months and follow-up for 24 months. 151 patients randomized, and the code for intervention was released in October 2017. The inclusion criteria were Canadian criteria, age 18 to 65, and we had a lot of questionnaires to give several endpoints, and the primary endpoint was self-reported based on registrations of symptoms by patients every 2 weeks, but we also tried to measure physical activity objectively by SenseWear armbands, and we did sub-studies trying to evaluate endothelial function, cardiopulmonary exercise tests, and gastrointestinal function, both at baseline and repeated after 18 months to see. Now, as I told you, the Rituximab trial is being considered by a journal, so I cannot give you details of the outcome, but we have stated in public before, for ethical reasons, that the study was negative, that we couldn't find a significant difference between the rituximab and placebo groups. And the reason why we did that, because we knew there were off-label treatment around in the world, patients taking the treatment outside clinical trials. I cannot give you any more details about the study now because it has to await for the final consideration by the journal. So I will tell you a little bit about the cyclomide trial, which is an open-label phase 2 trial with cyclophosphamide in ME/CFS, based on observations of several patients with long-standing ME/CFS who got cancer and reported benefit on the symptoms. We did first a pilot study in 2014, gave 3 ME patients 6 infusions with 4 weeks intervals. One of them was a non-responder, 1 patient responded for approximately 1 year, and 1 severe patient which was bedridden and had less than 300 steps per 24 hours. She had a long-lasting response for almost 4 years now and can still walk 5 to 10 kilometers several times each week. She's not completely healthy, but she seemed to improve. So that was a pilot study, and we have therefore performed an open-label phase 2 trial, and that's again exploratory study trying to learn something about the mechanisms and to see for the feasibility, so that we can be able to design a new randomized trial. That's our hope. So this is a limitation. 40 patients were given 6 cyclophosphamide infusions with 4 weeks intervals and been followed now for almost 3 years. And the questions we ask, is cyclophosphamide associated with the clinical benefit? What are the side effects and the toxicity and the tolerability? Cyclophosphamide is a cytotoxic drug that's used in oncology, but it also had broad immune modulatory properties. So it's also used in rheumatology, modulating inflammation. So the inclusion criteria were like this. Age 18 to 65 years, they had to be disease duration at least 2 years, and we did not include mild patients. I don't mean that mild ME/CFS is a big problem also, but we tried to take patients that were either moderate or severe or moderate to severe ME/CFS, but not those that were unable to care for themselves at all, not the very severe group. 40 patients, and this is an exploratory study. 26 patients were treatment naive and 14 had received rituximab previously. The mean age was 42 years almost, and half of the included patients had been sick for a long time with a disease duration more than 10 years. And the outcome measures were similar to what we did in rituximab, except that we measured steps more often, both at baseline, 9, 12, 18, and 24 months. So the data have been analyzed, and the manuscript is in preparation. I can tell you that the response data are interesting, but we cannot state it yet because it's unpublished. The toxicity has been acceptable, but with discomfort for patients due to the cytotoxic drugs, especially the first 4 months. So cyclophosphamide is a cytotoxic drug that can affect fertility. There's a 15% chance of premature menopause in women more than 35 years from this schedule, and there can be rare but severe and not negligible side effects which may occur. We haven't seen this in this study, but if you treat enough large number of patients, you can see more severe side effects. So we will have to be very cautious in interpreting the response data when we will see that when we publish it. And I think that cyclophosphamide should not be used outside clinical trials for ME/CFS until before we have done a randomized study and shown if there is a true effect of the drug. So what we are doing now is to do extensive laboratory investigations using serial samples from patients in these trials, trying to strengthen or weaken the case for a new randomized trial with cyclophosphamide versus placebo in ME. Is there a true effect, or is it placebo mechanism? Is it natural symptom variation over time? These are very important questions that we need to address. And we have been wondering, due to the still unknown pathomechanisms of ME/CFS and unknown etiology, is really the more unspecific immune modulation by cyclophosphamide, which we know affect different lymphocyte subsets, both T, B, and K cells. Is that in fact an advantage in ME/CFS compared to rituximab, which is a very broad B-cell, narrow and specific B-cell depleting agent? because we don't know yet the precise disease mechanisms. So for the last 12 minutes, is that, yeah. I'm okay? Yeah. I will tell you a little bit about the research focus from the laboratory studies. This was a quick overview of the clinical trials. And I think one advantage of doing clinical trials is that we get very carefully characterized and carefully followed patients throughout the study, standardizing of biobank sampling, registrations, everything is put into system. I think that's a good thing. So what we have been asking ourselves, based on the laboratory data that I will discuss with you, is there in fact an ineffective utilization of glucose as a proper fuel for the citric acid cycle, the TCA cycle in ME/CFS? And we have been wondering if this includes a reversible and functional inhibition of an important enzyme, the pyruvate dehydrogenase PDH enzyme. I'll show you what it is, just introduce you to the thought. This PDH enzyme catalyzes the irreversible conversion of pyruvate, which is the endpoint of glycolysis to acetyl coenzyme A, which enter the citric acid cycle for fueling. And do the patients try to cope with this inhibition with an increased use of substrates that can fuel the TCA cycle independent of this enzyme, such as specific amino acids and fatty acids? And we also think that maybe the majority of the metabolite alterations that we see are secondary and compensatory to such an obstruction in a way in this central energy pathway. An important question to me is also, what is the link between the immune system and this alteration of the central energy pathway? We thought it was the B cells, but the case for B cells are at least weakened by the result of our study. So it could be the T cells. Is it the innate immune system? How is the link between the immune system and these energy metabolite alterations? So this is a very simplified overview of the metabolism of carbohydrates to energy. Sugars, which is carbohydrates, are metabolized through the glycolysis to pyruvate. And this enzyme, PDH, is in the mitochondria. And with the green square that you can see, we are suspecting that this is impaired, probably as a part of a bigger picture, some kind of metabolic switch or change that many of the other researchers have also discussed in these few days, which is very interesting, some kind of modulation of the metabolic pattern. And we know that if you have lack of oxygen, you can have lactic acid, and if you have oxygen present in the mitochondria, you can have TCA cycle activation and energy, which is ATP. And you can see that the specific amino acids and fatty acids, they can fuel the TCA cycle downstream of this PDH enzyme. So the little bit more complex picture of the same thing, the central energy pathway, glucose taken up by the cells, converted in glycolysis to pyruvate, which is converted to acetyl coenzyme A, entering the TCA cycle, and giving energy in the presence of OXPHOS with oxygen, ATP. And you can see again, amino acids, fatty acids, and ketones are substrates for the TCA cycle, which are not dependent of the PDH enzyme. So we've first focused on amino acids, and there has been several previous studies looking at amino acid metabolism in ME/CFS. Several of those were present at the meeting. We have several studies from the Australian group showing that you have reduced levels of several amino acids, both in the study from 2007, 2012, and 2015 from Christopher Armstrong and his co-workers. Navio paper from 2016 showed that there were reduced plasma levels of branched amino acids proline and arginine. And we had our paper from 2016, metabolic profiling indicates an impaired PDH function in ME/CFS. And what did we look for first? We looked for all the amino acids in serum and the derived amino acids that we can measure, and hypothesized that this disturbed central energy metabolism can cause changes in the serum amino acid profile. And we know that serum amino acids, they are a little bit, can fluctuate, and they are dependent on diet and habits, and a little bit can vary from over time. So we have also measured them several times during the follow-up in the studies. But what's a good thing about the clinical trials is that we have the data from disease severity, disease duration. We know the physical activity measured by steps. We know the quality of life. And we analyzed 153 non-fasting patients and 102 healthy controls. And what we saw was that the sum of all the amino acids that can convert to pyruvate, we looked at how can amino acids be used for energy when they are catabolized. We saw that there were no difference, especially in female patients, there were no difference for the amino acid that can enter at the pyruvate level, but for amino acids that can enter at the acetyl coenzyme A level or that can replenish the intermediates of the TCA cycle, they were significantly lower in female patients, maybe indicating that these female patients use these amino acids as sources for energy. That's what we are thinking. In male patients, we saw that there were increased level of amino acid called 3-methylhistidine, which is a marker of endogenous protein catabolism. Men have usually more muscles than women and may use muscle catabolism as a source for energy. So we were hypothesizing that there seems to be an increased use of alternative substrates for a TCA cycle oxidation and energy. And is this possibly as part of a bigger picture due to an obstruction in the effective glucose oxidation, including a functional and reversible obstruction at the PDH level? And then we tried to measure the enzymes and then that are known to inhibit the PDH enzyme. We measured that in blood cells at the RNA level, and we saw that these enzymes, PDK 1, 2, and 4, they inhibit the PDH enzyme. They were upregulated, so it seemed to fit with the hypothesis. So there could be other explanations for this. There could be fasting or diet habits, but we saw that the triglyceride levels, they are equal in ME and CFS patients, indicating that there's no big difference in postprandial status. And we see similar findings from other research groups also present at the meeting. But it is important to know that this is a cross-sectional study design, therefore it's suggesting mechanism. And some people claim that this is just because they are lying down or much as the rest. But when we look for these associations, for instance, to the physical activity level or the disease severity, we cannot see a clear association. So it's associated with the disease, and it's probably not deconditioning based on our data. And then, just to give you a small snapshot of the metabolism data we have for fatty acids, I will tell you that a little bit about that. Because if there is an impaired PDH function, as I have told you about, we would then expect that there is an increased conversion of pyruvate to lactate if you stress the system and put the patient under strain. And that's what patients are telling us. They seem to have sore muscles and quickly feeling of lactate in their muscles. Reduced ATP production and this energy deprivation. And we would expect that they, in addition to using amino acids from serum, also use fatty acids, which is a major source for TCA oxidation and energy. And therefore we have analyzed a lot of fatty acids among many other metabolites, trying to underpin this data. And this is just a snapshot as examples from the saturated fatty acids that we have measured in ME/CFS patients, and you can see it divided by women and men. Most of these fatty acids are downregulated, reduced in serum levels, especially the short and medium-chained fatty acids in both gender. So we don't have to go into the details. And we looked at the TCA cycle intermediates, which are part of the citric acid cycle. These are also reduced. Some of them are equal to healthy, such as citrate. And in accordance with the model that we are thinking, there's a slight increase in pyruvate, both in the ME/CFS patient. That would fit with an obstruction at the PDH level. So to conclude this, we think that this are features of a struggle for energy by the patients. There is a putative PDH inhibition with change of substrates for how the patients try to get the acetyl coenzyme A, which they take from amino acids and fatty acids. It resembles physiological mechanisms that are activated by fasting or starvation, and it resembles mechanisms that are activated by endurance exercise. And I think that in ME/CFS patients, these mechanisms appear to be activated at rest or at minimal exertion. It's not a normal physiologic regulation. So this impairment of the central energy pathway seems to be present in both male and female patients. Well, I think that the two genders have different way of coping with this. They have different compensatory mechanisms, which are partly sex-specific. So if there is a metabolic obstruction in the central energy pathway, possibly including the PDH level, it can describe some of the features that patients at least tell me. The devastating lack of energy, they feel this devastating total lack of energy, and the lactate accumulation after minimal exertion, which has also been measured. It looks like a patient's use anaerobic metabolism, so somehow it resembles hypoxia, which could be real or could be perceived due to signaling disturbances. So we are wondering if there is an ineffective glucose utilization, a switch in the metabolic pattern as part of the mechanisms, and it's important then to understand why this occurs. Somehow it has to do with the immune system, I think, because in 70% this disease develops after infection. So this is the last slide, just the same figure. The lack of energy, ineffective glucose utilization, lactic acid production, use of alternative substrates to try to keep the energy levels up. That's what we are thinking. And this is part of a bigger picture and that's the good thing being at such a very nice meeting. Hearing from excellent researchers from different groups, telling us how they look at this, and we find common things. We find that, okay, we will have to adjust this one. And during the next year, I really hope that we both can give you more information on the clinical trials. Maybe we are doing new trials, and I'm sure